The fluorescent hum in the shopping mall after closing with lights still on was a flat, persistent drone, a sound not meant for human ears in such an emptiness. My footsteps, usually muffled by the daytime clamor, echoed with an almost aggressive clarity against the polished floors. Each click of my sole on the tiles seemed to splinter the vast, artificial silence, sending shivers up my spine that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. I had come for a package, a final, uncatalogued box from the estate, retrieved from a secure storage unit tucked away in a forgotten corner of this sprawling retail tomb. The security guard, a gaunt man with eyes like chips of flint, had merely grunted, pointing me down a deserted corridor where the scent of stale popcorn and disinfectant wrestled with phantom perfumes. It was a bizarre, liminal space, a monument to commerce rendered spectral by its vacancy, a stark counterpoint to the wild, untamed legacy I was slowly beginning to inherit. The box itself, wrapped in thick brown paper and bound with twine that felt rough and brittle beneath my fingertips, held the faint scent of mildew and something else, something ancient, like dried earth and forgotten paper. It was a tangible piece of the legacy, a crumbling ancestral estate nestled deep within a landscape that time seemed to have forgotten. The drive had been a descent into verdant isolation, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to tracks overgrown with moss, until the world narrowed to the whisper of leaves and the distant cry of some unseen bird of prey. The house itself, when it finally loomed into view through a shroud of mist, was a silhouette of jagged gables and sagging eaves, a monument to a forgotten prosperity. Its stone facade, pitted and stained by centuries of weather, seemed to absorb the twilight rather than reflect it, a hungry maw in the encroaching gloom. It was a cartographer's nightmare of unmapped decay, and yet, a challenge I felt compelled to face. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of ages, a fine particulate haze that glittered in the meager light filtering through grimy windows. I carried the package to a sturdy oak table in what was once, perhaps, a study, its surfaces scarred with ink stains and the rings left by countless forgotten cups. My hands, accustomed to the delicate dance of historical restoration, untied the knots with a practiced precision, a small, almost reverent ritual. The paper crackled as I peeled it back, revealing not a collection of personal effects as I had expected, but a single, rolled parchment. It was a map. My breath caught, not just from the dust, but from the sudden, sharp jolt of professional intrigue. My life had been spent deciphering the faded lines and forgotten names on ancient charts, breathing life back into forgotten geographies. This was different. This was my land, the very estate I now stood upon, depicted with an impossible, almost hallucinatory level of detail. The curling edges, yellowed and fragile, spoke of immense age, yet the ink, a deep, resonant black, retained a startling vibrancy. It was a testament to an artist's dedication, or perhaps, an obsession. Every tree, every boulder, every meandering stream on the property was rendered with an obsessive fidelity, each contour line traced with a hand both skilled and unerringly patient. I saw the familiar outline of the main house, the crumbling walls of the old stable, the winding path to the overgrown cemetery. But then my cartographer's eye, trained to spot anomalies, snagged. There were features I did not recognize. A series of concentric circles, etched with a stark, almost violent precision, marked a spot deep within the untouched woods, a place I had not yet dared to explore. Further out, near the property line, a sequence of jagged, almost runic symbols snaked along what appeared to be an underground channel, its purpose utterly alien to any conventional drainage system I knew. And most unsettling of all, the map was incomplete. It simply stopped. Abruptly. As if the cartographer had then interrupted mid-stroke, or perhaps, had simply refused to chart whatever lay beyond that terrifying, unseen boundary. A deliberate lacuna. The paper here was pristine, unmarred by ink, yet it felt heavier, somehow, than the meticulously drawn sections. This wasn't merely an old map, it was an enigma, a challenge that resonated with something deeper than professional interest. It felt like an invitation. Or perhaps, a warning. My fingers, tracing the edge of that terrible blankness, felt a tremor. The estate had secrets, yes, but this map suggested they were not merely historical curiosities. They were active. They were waiting. And in that moment, in the hushed gloom of a forgotten study, I knew I had to complete it. I had lingered too long, gathering the last provisions for my journey, allowing the quiet to seep into my bones, a prelude to the profound solitude awaiting me. The automatic doors sighed open, releasing me into the damp, cool breath of the pre-dawn. The drive was a slow unraveling from the familiar, the highway's drone gradually giving way to the gravel crunch of backroads, then finally, to the overgrown track that marked the estate's true boundary. The air shifted, growing heavier, tasting of damp earth and something ancient, something that had been undisturbed for too long. The GPS signal had vanished miles back, leaving me to navigate by the faded, unsettling map I'd found amongst my ancestors' papers, the one that whispered of more than just property lines. The house, when it finally emerged from the shroud of overgrown trees, was a study in decay. Its clabbered skin, once painted a dignified cream, was now a mottled canvas of peeling paint and dark, creeping moss. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy brows of sagging eaves. This was not merely an old house, it was a sentinel, a silent keeper of forgotten things. My first days were a methodical dance with the past. I unpacked my surveyor's tools, my detailed topographical maps, my compass and GPS, laying them out like instruments for a delicate surgery. The inherited map, brittle and stained, became my primary text, its elegant, antiquated script and unusual symbols a constant puzzle. My task, I told myself, was simply to reconcile its archaic contours with the modern landscape, to complete the gaps my ancestor had left. The property stretched further than I had anticipated, a tangle of wild woodland and neglected fields. Armed with my tools and the enigmatic map, I began my systematic exploration. The first discrepancy struck me near what should have been the old northern boundary, according to the modern deeds. There, half swallowed by a thicket of thorny bushes and gnarled oaks, stood a low, crumbling wall of rough-hewn stones. It wasn't merely old, it felt forgotten, a silent testament to a structure that had been swallowed by time and earth. No mention of it on any contemporary record, yet the inherited map, in a faint, almost invisible ink, marked a faint, irregular line precisely where the wall now lay. What had it once enclosed? A garden? A forgotten outbuilding? The light here felt thinner, as if swallowed by the very air. As I pushed deeper, the anomalies began to multiply. One moment, the sun warmed my back, the next, a frigid pocket of air enveloped me, raising gooseflesh on my arms before dissipating just as quickly. Then came the stones. Not the familiar fieldstones of a farmer's wall, but standing stones, weathered and gray, half buried in the soil. There were three, forming a rough triangle in a clearing where the trees grew unnaturally tall and close, their branches interwoven like a protective cage. They bore no carvings, no obvious purpose. They didn't align with any property lines I knew, nor did they mark a well or a grave, at least not in any conventional sense. Yet, the old map hinted at their presence with subtle, almost imperceptible dots, as if they were points on a forgotten grid. A faint, high-pitched whine seemed to hum in the air around them, too subtle to be a cicada, too persistent to be the wind. It was a sound that vibrated more in my teeth than in my ears, a low, barely audible thrum that made the hairs on my neck prickle. My cartographer's precision was being challenged, not by inaccuracies in the old map, but by the land itself. It was as if the estate held secrets the modern world had chosen to ignore, or perhaps, forgotten how to see. The old map wasn't wrong, it was more right, depicting a landscape layered with unseen histories, hidden structures, and an unsettling, palpable presence. The mannequins, frozen in their synthetic smiles and permanent poses, seemed to watch from the glass storefronts, their plastic eyes reflecting the stark, unblinking light. I clutched the heavy bag of provisions, canned goods, fresh batteries, a new ream of drawing paper, a small bulwark against the deepening isolation of the estate. The artificial brightness here, so alien to the encroaching gloom of my ancestral home, offered a brittle, temporary reprieve. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to the winding, unkempt lane leading to the estate. The trees, denser here, seemed to lean inward, their branches gnarled and skeletal against the moonless sky. When I finally pulled the vehicle into the sagging carriage house, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal perfume that clung to the very stones of the place. I set about my routines, stacking the provisions, tidying my work table. It was then, as I reached for a stack of old journals, that I noticed the shift. A small, tarnished silver locket, one I'd explicitly placed beneath a heavy book, now lay atop it, gleaming faintly in the periphery of my light. I paused, my hand hovering. Had I moved it? My memory, usually a sharp, meticulous tool, offered no such recollection. I dismissed it, a trick of the light, perhaps. My own absent-mindedness. The fatigue of the long drive. The following days settled into a rhythm of work and observation, though the latter began to overshadow the former. Dust motes danced in sunbeams, nothing more. Then came the sounds. Faint, almost imagined. It wasn't the wind, for the windows were sealed, and the air within was still. It was a rustle, a sigh, a breath that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a subtle vibration in the ancient plaster. I would halt my work, my ear straining, but it would always dissipate, leaving behind only the creaks and groans of an old house settling, or so I told myself. The objects continued their subtle rebellion. My compass, which I always left precisely aligned on the northeast corner of my map table, was found tilted, its needle pointing south-southwest. A specific drafting pen, one I'd placed in its holder, was lying on the floor beneath the table. Each instance was small, easily rationalized away. A draft, a clumsy brush of my own arm, a memory lapse. But the accumulation of these small, inexplicable events began to erode the smooth surface of my logic. A tremor of unease, faint but persistent, began to snake through my carefully constructed composure. The nights brought a new, more visceral form of disturbance. Sleep, once my refuge, became a descent into unsettling dreams. The faint scent of something metallic and cloying, like old iron mixed with decay. There was a sense of being drawn downwards, into something vast and hungry, a silent, demanding presence beneath the land itself. I would wake gasping, the taste of dust in my mouth, the impression of something vast and unseen lingering in the air, only to be dispelled by the pale dawnlight filtering through the grimy window panes. One afternoon, seeking solace in the meticulous lines of my work, I returned to the inherited map. I had been poring over the section depicting the estate's lower grounds, an area marked with curious, faded symbols that resisted my interpretation. The ink, which I had sworn was faded and static, seemed to possess a deeper saturation in one particular quadrant. A faint, almost imperceptible line, a sinuous, branching path, now ran from a previously unmarked cluster of trees towards the ancient spring house. It was a detail I knew, with an absolute certainty that rattled me to my core, had not been there before. Or perhaps it had been so faint, so utterly subliminal, that my conscious mind had simply overlooked it. Yet, the way it stood out now, almost throbbing with a subtle, internal light, felt less like an oversight and more like a deliberate revelation. I traced the new line with a trembling finger, my breath catching in my throat. It was not just a line, it had a texture, a faint raised quality, as if it had been etched into the very parchment itself. My logical mind scrambled, desperate for an explanation. The paper expanding? A trick of the light, playing on the aged fibers? But the line was too precise, too deliberate in its new prominence. It felt active. The estate, I realized with a sickening lurch, was not merely decaying around me, it was reaching out. The emptiness pressed in, not with the quiet peace of solitude, but with a lingering, sterile anxiety. I moved with a singular purpose, the incomplete map, now a heavier burden in my mind than in my hands, pulling me back to the estate, to the silence that was less empty, more watchful. The drive back was a blur of highway lights and encroaching darkness. Each mile brought a tightening in my chest, a sense of nearing not just a destination, but a reckoning. I didn't bother with the main hall. My destination was the forgotten study, a room I'd only briefly glimpsed during my initial survey of the property, tucked away behind a tapestry on the second floor. It smelled of forgotten lives, of leather and paper decay, a scent that clung to the very dust motes dancing in the weak beam of my flashlight. I pulled back the heavy velvet, revealing a room crammed with shelves, their contents obscured by years of neglect. This was where the answers would lie, if they existed at all. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the dwindling charge of my lamp and the growing stack of discarded tomes. My fingers, stained with grime and the faint yellow of aged paper, ached from turning brittle pages. Their covers were cracked, the pages within a delicate mosaic of foxing in faded ink. The first journal, its script a spidery, almost frantic scrawl, belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Ilara. Her entries began innocuously enough, detailing daily life, the changing seasons, the trials of managing the estate. But slowly, subtly, the tone shifted. Her descriptions of strange occurrences began to align with the unsettling markings on my map. A recurring symbol she called the Eye of the Well appeared near a location I'd marked as a collapsed spring house. Another entry detailed the Weeping Stone, a phrase that resonated with a particularly jagged, isolated rock formation I'd sketched in the northern woods. Then came the disappearances. Not just servants, she wrote, but family members. My brother, Alistair, gone into the woods and never returned. The searchers found only the scent of wet earth and something else. A tang of rust and fear. The entries grew more erratic, punctuated by desperate prayers and increasingly paranoid observations. Ilara spoke of a hunger beneath the roots, a force that demanded its due. Her final entry was a single, smeared word, sacrifice. I moved to the next journal, written by a later descendant, a man. His script was firmer, but the content was no less disturbing. He, too, mentioned specific locations, describing a place of churning earth where nothing would grow, which I recognized as a barren patch marked on my map with a series of concentric circles. One letter, dated 1887, from a cousin to the then estate owner, urged them to abandon the cursed ground. It asks too much, demands too much. The madness takes root in the blood, like a weed. Another, from a solicitor, referenced unexplained absences and the unfortunate legacy of the property. My head swam with the weight of these revelations. The dust motes in the lamp's beam seemed to swirl with the ghosts of these forgotten lives. Each cryptic marking, each incomplete line, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a silent testament to the horrors that had unfolded here. The land wasn't just old, it was alive with something terrible. The map wasn't merely a guide to hidden features, it was a key, I now understood with a sickening certainty, to something ancient, hungry, and deeply, irrevocably malevolent. And I, Reed, had been meticulously, unknowingly, drawing its path to freedom. The map, spread beneath the lamp's unwavering glow, pulsed with a rhythm only I could perceive. Each line, each archaic symbol, no longer a mere geographical notation but a vein, a nerve, connecting me to something unspeakable beneath the earth. My head throbbed with the weight of it all, the dust motes dancing in the beam, tiny, swirling specters of forgotten lives. This was no abstract puzzle, it was a blueprint of dread, a diagram of suffering, each cryptic marking an echo of a scream. The air, which had always felt cool and still in the study, now carried a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor. It was not a vibration of the house, but of the very air itself, as if the molecules were agitated by an unseen presence. The whispers, once a faint, indistinct murmur at the periphery of my hearing, began to sharpen. They no longer merely brushed against the edges of my sanity, they sought purchase, like burrs catching on wool. I could almost discern syllables, fragments of words, like broken glass catching the light. A faint, metallic tang, like old pennies and forgotten iron, pricked at the back of my throat. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry, and my gaze darted around the room, seeking a source, any rational explanation for the sudden shift. Then, a sudden, jarring shift in my perception. The study, with its scent of aged paper and wood polish, dissolved. In its place, I stood under a relentless, humming white light. I was in a vast, empty expanse, the polished floors reflecting the stark fluorescence above. The quiet was profound, broken only by the incessant, high-pitched whine of the overhead lighting. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Reed. Just as suddenly, the vision tore. I was back in the study, gasping, my hand pressed against the cool, smooth surface of the desk. The map lay innocently beneath my palm. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and sweat beaded on my forehead. Had I truly been there? Or was my mind, frayed by sleepless nights and the relentless pressure of this ancestral secret, finally beginning to unravel? They were no longer vague suggestions but distinct, intelligible threats, coalescing from the agitated air. The land demands. A tremor ran through the desk, rattling the inkwell. The quill, which had been resting precisely in its holder, clattered to the floor, its feather trembling as if in a phantom breeze. I stared at it, then at the map, then at the heavy oak door. My resolve, which had been a sturdy anchor, began to fray. I needed to speak to someone, anyone, to puncture the suffocating isolation. My hand, trembling, reached for the old rotary telephone on a nearby side table. I fumbled with the dial, my fingers clumsy as I tried to recall the archivist's number, a colleague who might, just might, listen without judgment. I need to tell you something. About the estate. About the map. There was a pause, a beat of professional patience. Read? Are you quite all right? You sound distressed. Distressed doesn't cover it, I choked out, trying to articulate the impossible. There's something here. Something living beneath the property. It's tied to my lineage, to the map. It's speaking to me. It's moving things. My words tumbled out, disjointed and frantic, sounding utterly insane even to my own ears. Another pause, longer this time. Read, perhaps you've been working too hard on that old property. It sounds like you need to step away for a bit. Get some rest. Old houses can play tricks on the mind. The voice was kind, but laced with a clear, dismissive skepticism. No, you don't understand. I pleaded, my grip tightening on the receiver. It's real. I saw it. I heard it. It was in a mall. It grew louder, a buzzing crescendo, until it was a shriek in my ear, a sound like 1,000 insects tearing through wire. I ripped the receiver from my head, the plastic warm against my hand, and stared at it in horror. Silence descended again, heavier, more profound than before. I was alone. Utterly, terribly alone. You are ours. And you will complete the work. The receiver, still warm from my grip, lay discarded on the polished wood of the hall table. My ears still hummed with the aftershock of that violent static, 1,000 insects tearing through wire, a sound that felt less like an electrical fault and more like a scream from the earth itself. The archivist's voice, whatever final words he might have uttered, was obliterated, lost to that shriek. I couldn't stay. The estate, with its whispering walls and the incessant creak of settling timbers, had become a cage of impending dread. I drove without conscious thought, the car a metal shell against the encroaching night, until the familiar glow of the city's periphery pulled me in. I needed light, artificial and unwavering, a stark contrast to the shifting shadows of the ancestral home. I needed a space so devoid of natural life that it might mute the insistent hum that now thrummed beneath my own skin. I found myself in a shopping mall after closing with lights still on. The automatic doors sighed open, then closed behind me with a soft, final hiss. The vast expanse of polished tile stretched before me, reflecting the harsh, uniform glare of the overhead fluorescence. Storefronts, glass eyes staring blankly, lined the wide promenades. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of unseen ventilation systems and the faint, tinny echo of my own footsteps. It was a sterile, unsettling quiet, a place designed for a cacophony of commerce now utterly bereft of human sound. I pulled out my tablet, the screen a small, defiant rectangle of light in the cavernous space. On it was the most recent, most detailed photograph I'd taken of the incomplete map, the one with the strange, looping symbols and the deeply etched lines that defied any known cartographic convention. For weeks, I had pored over it, comparing it to historical surveys, to geological reports, to old family letters hinting at hidden features and strange traditions. My cartographer's mind sought order, logic, a system. But the map resisted. It seemed to shift, to subtly alter its meaning depending on the angle of the light, the fatigue in my eyes. Now, under the unblinking gaze of the mall's fluorescence, something shifted within me. My finger traced the lines on the screen, following the intricate, almost organic patterns that radiated from the estate's central point. I had always assumed these were boundaries, pathways to forgotten structures, perhaps even veins of a precious mineral. The lines weren't paths. They weren't boundaries. They were bindings. The strange, looping symbols, once inscrutable, resolved into a complex, interlocking glyph. Not a marker, but a ward. Not a destination, but a seal. The entire map wasn't a guide to something, but a blueprint of something contained. It depicted a vast, intricate prison, buried deep beneath the very land I had inherited, designed to hold an entity of immense, ancient power. I zoomed in, my fingers trembling slightly. Faint, almost imperceptible fissures spiderwebbed across the depicted glyphs, tiny cracks in the intricate patterns, like hairline fractures in ancient stone. The lines, once so bold and definite, now seemed to flicker, to vibrate with a barely contained energy. The prison was weakening. The seal was failing. My breath hitched. The archivist's fractured call, the violent static that had screamed in my ear, it wasn't a faulty connection. It was the sound of something tearing, something breaking through. It was the entity, stirring, pressing against its crumbling confines, its malevolent awareness bleeding into the world. And then, the most horrifying realization of all, I was here. I, Reed, the meticulous cartographer, the last of my line, drawn to this estate, to this map, with an almost supernatural compulsion. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. My ancestors hadn't merely lived on this land, they had been its wardens, its jailers, passing down the burden of maintaining the prison, of keeping the entity bound. I had been drawn here, not to complete the map, but to complete a cycle. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, heavier than any stone. The vast, empty mall, with its blazing, indifferent lights, suddenly felt like a stage, and I, the solitary performer, was trapped in the spotlight of an unfolding, terrible drama. The entity knew I was here. And it was waiting. The arc. I had fled. The need to put distance between myself and the encroaching presence, to find some sterile, neutral ground where thought might again assemble itself, had been an animal impulse. Hours passed in a blur of asphalt and fading roadside lights. I drove until the glow of a distant city promised anonymity, a place too mundane for ancient horrors. Its glass doors, usually a swirling vortex of humanity, stood locked, reflecting my haggard face like a distorted ghost. A security guard, a stout man with weary eyes, had merely watched me from his perch in the central atrium, a silent sentinel in a cathedral of consumerism, before nodding me through a service entrance I hadn't realized I was looking for. Now, within its brightly lit, desolate corridors, the air hung heavy with the ghosts of forgotten perfumes and the lingering scent of floor polish. The ceaseless, high-pitched hum of the fluorescent lights was the only constant companion, a thin, vibrating wire stretched taut across the cavernous space. My footsteps echoed, stark and singular, against the polished tiles, each sound swallowed by the oppressive emptiness. Mannequins, frozen in postures of perpetual aspiration, stared from behind plate glass, their vacant eyes seeming to track my every move. I walked past the silent cash registers, the neatly stacked clothes, the glistening displays of jewelry, each artifact of daily life rendered uncanny by its unnatural stillness. Then, the arc returned. Not a sound this time, but a sensation, a cold pressure blossoming behind my eyes, spreading like ink through the delicate tendrils of my brain. It was a thought that wasn't mine, yet felt intimately familiar, a whisper in the deepest chamber of my mind. You seek, Reed. You always seek. The words were formless, a pure impression of hunger, of an ancient, insatiable curiosity that mirrored my own, but twisted into something vile. For a moment, The man in the glass was not me. It was an attempt, I knew, to graft itself onto my very being, to inhabit the space behind my eyes. Come closer, the thought pulsed, resonating with a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated through my teeth. The map is not complete. There is more to reveal. More to become. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command, a lure towards a deeper revelation, a final, irreversible opening. The air there felt thick, cloying, like breathing dust. It was a passage from one of the estate's oldest journals, a meticulous, almost obsessive account penned by an ancestor long since turned to dust. Not a map, but a description of an anti-ritual, a final, desperate measure taken when the veil between worlds thinned too greatly. It spoke not of sealing, but of unmaking. To reverse the act of revelation, one must perform an act of profound negation. The ancestor had written of a severance of the seeker's hand, a symbolic gesture of relinquishing the very impulse that led to discovery. It meant sacrificing the meticulous part of myself, the cartographer, the one who sought pattern and truth in the hidden corners of the world. It meant, in a sense, unmapping my own mind. The entity's presence intensified, swirling around me like a frigid wind, pressing against my skull. It recognized the threat of my dawning understanding. Fool! You have opened the way. You cannot close it. You are the key. You are the door. You are. The stakes became brutally clear. This was not just about the estate, or my lineage, or even my sanity. This entity, this devourer of hidden things, if fully unleashed, would not merely consume land or life. It sought to unmap reality itself. And I, Reed, the cartographer, was the only one left who knew the true coordinates of its prison, and the devastating price of its release. The choice was stark: succumb to its insidious lure and become its instrument, or perform the ultimate act of self-erasure, severing the very essence of my being to prevent an apocalypse of understanding. The static had clotted my mind, 1,000 tiny talons scraping the inside of my skull, but in its wake, something else had settled. A clarity. A cold, unyielding resolve born from the wreckage of my sanity. The receiver, still warm against the polished wood, seemed to hum with a residual malevolence, yet I no longer flinched. The path, terrible as it was, lay before me. The map, now a living, pulsing thing in my memory, whispered of a final descent, a chamber forgotten by daylight, a place where the earth's ancient heart beat with a corrupted rhythm. I moved with an unnatural calm, my hand steady as I gathered the items I had painstakingly, horrifyingly, deciphered from the obscure markings on the parchment: a bowl of tarnished silver, a sliver of petrified wood. Something far older, far more potent. The air in the study, usually thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like distant thunder. The air thickened, pressing in on me, stale and heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something charnel, ancient. This was no longer about discovery, it was about survival, about severing a lineage of torment. The narrow tunnel twisted, descended, and then, without warning, the stone gave way to something else entirely. The lantern's beam fractured, scattering across polished, reflective surfaces. A low, continuous hum, like a giant, sedated insect, vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. The dank, earthy smell vanished, replaced by the faint, antiseptic tang of cleaning solution, overlaid with the ghost of synthetic perfumes and stale popcorn. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow that bleached the vibrant colors of the storefronts to sickly pastels. Empty aisles stretched into the distance, lined with mannequins frozen in silent, vacant poses. This was not real. This could not be real. The entity was playing its cruel games. A wave of nausea washed over me. The air, though seemingly clean, felt thick, cloying, as if I were breathing something predigested. My footsteps, usually muffled by the estate's thick carpets, echoed with unnerving clarity across the polished linoleum, each sound stretching into the vast, deserted space. You are lost. You are one of us. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to anchor myself to the reality of cold stone and damp earth. This was a trap. A mental labyrinth. I had to find the way through. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to patterns and hidden lines, desperately sought an egress. The mall was a map, but a false one, designed to disorient. Then, a sound. A rhythmic, deliberate scraping. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw it. And from it, slowly, deliberately, a figure began to emerge. It moved with a lurching, uneven gait, each step accompanied by that scraping sound, as if dragging something heavy, something wrong. It was my heart, or a reflection of it, the core of my lineage, being consumed from within. The ritual was not just a sacrifice to the entity, it was a desperate attempt to sever myself from being the sacrifice, to cut the cord of this inherited hunger. You cannot escape your blood, the collective voice hissed, growing louder, closer. You are merely a vessel. We are coming home. The entity, manifesting as my devoured lineage, began to move. Faster, its many faces contorting in a silent, ravenous roar. The aisles seemed to narrow, the storefronts pressing in, their glass eyes reflecting the horror. But the sight of that gnawing, that endless consumption of the very essence of me, ignited a fresh surge of desperate resolve. This was not my end. I would not be another meal. My hands trembled, but my gaze was fixed on that pulsating, crimson maw. Beyond them, I knew, lay the true chamber, the heart of the estate's corruption. And I would reach it. I had to. The cold tendril, an unseen probing finger of pure hunger, brushed the edge of my awareness, threatening to unravel the very threads of my being. Its silent roar vibrated not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones, a promise of utter consumption. Every storefront window became an eye, reflecting the horror, amplifying it, pressing in on me like a collapsing cage. Panic clawed at my throat, but beneath it, a desperate clarity ignited. The map. The final, incomplete section, the one I had almost dismissed as an ancient cartographer's madness, flared in my mind. It was not a depiction of a physical place, but a sigil, a geometric trap designed to bind what could not be contained by stone or earth. It was a pattern of immense precision, requiring an absolute fixity of point and line. And here, in this vast, brightly lit tomb of commerce, I saw its canvas. My legs, heavy with dread, somehow found purchase. I pushed off, moving not in flight, but with a sudden, desperate purpose. The entity shrieked, a soundless tearing in the fabric of the air, and accelerated. It was a formless wave of gnashing teeth and weeping eyes, a tide of ancestral sorrow and malice. I sprinted past the silent mannequins, their vacant stares mocking my haste. The hum of the fluorescent lights above became a high-pitched whine, an unbearable pressure against my eardrums. I needed the central atrium, the vast, open space where the mall's primary axes converged. The map had shown a central point, a fixed origin from which all lines radiated, a core of stillness against chaos. No coalescing into a single, colossal visage that seemed to fill the entire length of an aisle, its eyes vast pools of ancient grief. Its mouth a gaping maw of oblivion. It was a trick, a psychological assault designed to paralyze. The floor tiles, a repeating pattern of pale squares, became my grid. The support pillars, spaced with meticulous regularity, became my markers. My cartographer's eye, honed by decades of finding order in chaos, saw the inherent structure, the hidden lines of force that could be bent to my will. Reaching the atrium, I stumbled, my lungs burning, my vision blurring at the edges. I could feel my own identity fraying, dissolving into the swirling mass. From my satchel, I fumbled for the last, incomplete page of the ancestral map. It was brittle, yellowed, its intricate lines almost faded. But the final sigil, the one I needed, was starkly drawn, a complex mandala of intersecting arcs and points. Here, it would be my weapon. You are mine, read, the collective consciousness of the entity hissed, 1,000 voices in one, your blood, your lineage, your end. I fell to my knees, ignoring the searing pain, ignoring the insidious drain. The mall's polished floor, usually pristine, felt gritty beneath my hands. I held the map page flat, my thumb tracing the sigil's lines. This was not about drawing a picture, it was about imposing order, about asserting a boundary where none had been. The central point. With trembling fingers, I pressed the chalk to the floor, drawing the first, foundational arc. The entity recoiled, a sudden, sharp intake of its formless mass. A gasp, a collective shudder. It was sensitive to definition, to the act of creation, of containment. Stop, the voices roared, now laced with a desperate fear. The mall lights flickered violently, plunging sections of the atrium into momentary gloom, then back to harsh brilliance. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something ancient, like dust in dried blood. Each stroke of the chalk was a defiant act, a barrier against the encroaching chaos. I used the pillars as reference points, aligning the arcs with their precise centers, ensuring the angles were exact, the distances true. My cartographic training, my obsessive need for accuracy, was now my shield. The entity raged, its formless mass surging, attempting to break my concentration. Visions flashed before my eyes, my parents, my grandparents, their faces distorted, screaming, trapped within the entity's maw. It tried to make me doubt, to make me stumble, to tell me that my efforts were futile, that I was merely drawing on a floor, that I was mad. But I pushed through, my mind a fortress of lines and angles. The map in my hand, now crumpled and stained, was my guide. I reached the final arc, the one that would complete the intricate pattern. My hand shook uncontrollably. The entity was a deafening roar in my head, 1,000 mouths screaming my name, threatening to tear my sanity asunder. It pressed down, a crushing weight that threatened to pin me to the floor. With a guttural cry, I drew the last line, connecting the final point, completing the sigil. The entity froze. Its many faces, twisted in a silent, ravenous roar, were suddenly still, locked in an eternal grimace. The vast, swirling mass began to shrink, to condense, not disappearing, but collapsing inward upon itself, drawn into the geometric prison I had meticulously charted. The hum of the fluorescent lights returned to its steady, unsettling drone. The storefront windows reflected only the empty, brightly lit aisles. I lay gasping, my body racked with exhaustion, my mind a shattered landscape. The entity was gone from the mall, banished, contained within the sigil I had etched. But it was not truly gone. The faces of my devoured lineage, though no longer swirling before me, were now etched into the back of my eyelids, a permanent gallery of silent screams. The victory was mine, but the price was a map of myself, forever incomplete, forever haunted. The searing pain, the insidious drain, they vanished not with a crescendo, but with a sudden, absolute cessation. I remained on my knees, a tremor running through me that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with a profound, terrifying quiet. My thumb, still pressed against the final lines of the sigil, felt a strange, lingering warmth, a ghostly echo of the power I had just channeled, or perhaps, contained. The map page, once a vibrant tapestry of lines and symbols, now lay inert, its ink settled, its purpose seemingly fulfilled. It was complete. Every line, every contour, every hidden chamber, every subterranean passage, every ancient boundary. The last stroke of my pen had been an assertion, a final, desperate imposition of order against the chaos that had threatened to unravel me entirely, and now, silence. The hum of the distant ventilation system, the low thrum of the fluorescent lights, the faint, electronic murmur from a forgotten display, these were the only sounds that dared to puncture the vast, echoing stillness. My breath hitched in my throat, not from exertion, but from the sheer, desolate emptiness that now filled the space where something ancient and terrible had just been. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, each joint an aching protest against gravity. My hands, once steady instruments of precision, now shook uncontrollably, a fine, persistent tremor that spoke of a deeper fracturing. My vision swam, the bright, artificial glow of the mall's lights blurring into halos around the deserted storefronts, each one a silent, watchful eye. The entity was gone. It was simply absent. But its absence was not peace. I stumbled towards a deserted bench outside a closed clothing boutique, the scent of stale air freshener and synthetic fabric mingling with the faint, metallic tang that still clung to my clothes, a memory of the underground. Fragments of what had transpired, of the earth's groan, of the entity's ancient hunger, flashed behind my eyes. I saw the estate, not as it was when I left it, but as it must be now, a desolate ruin, the very ground scarred by the violence of our struggle, the ancient structure having borne the brunt of the final, desperate push. My reflection in the polished glass of a display window startled me. My face was a mask of exhaustion, lines etched deep around my eyes, my skin pallid, almost translucent under the harsh lights. But it wasn't just the physical toll that unnerved me. It was the eyes. They held a different light now, a depth that felt alien, a knowledge that was both terrifying and profound. And that was the true cost. As the crushing weight of the entity's presence had receded, something else had seeped in, subtle and insidious. A fragment. Not of the entity itself, perhaps, but of its perspective. A new lens through which to view the world. I saw the faint, almost imperceptible currents of energy that flowed beneath the mall's pristine floor, the ancient lines of the earth's memory bleeding through the concrete and steel. I understood, with a horrifying clarity, the interconnectedness of all things, the deep, hidden arteries of the planet, and the vast, indifferent forces that moved within them. It was a revelation, a discovery of a new kind of cartography, one that transcended ink and paper, one that was etched directly onto my very being. The map I had completed was not merely a diagram of containment, it was a key, and I had turned it, unlocking not just the entity's cage, but a door within my own mind. I could feel the faint echo of ancient thoughts, not my own, but residing now in the deeper currents of my consciousness, an unwelcome inheritance. The tension, far from dissipating, merely shifted. The outside world, bustling with its oblivious routines, would wake to another day, unaware of the chasm that had opened and closed beneath their feet, but I knew. The true cost of victory, I realized, was not just the ruin of the estate, but the irreversible transformation of myself. I was Reed, the cartographer, but I was also something more, something ancient, something irrevocably changed. I remained on my knees, a tremor running through me that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the sudden, impossible void where the searing pain had been. Fluorescent hum, the distant thrum of unseen machinery, the faint scent of stale popcorn and disinfectant, these were the only anchors in a world that had just tilted on its axis. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the cavernous quiet. I pushed myself upright, each joint a grinding protest. My limbs felt heavy, yet strangely weightless, as if I were moving through water. The world outside the mall felt too bright, too loud. The passing vehicles on the street were streaks of raw color, their engines a cacophony. I walked, not knowing where I was going, until the city lights thinned and the familiar, winding road to the estate appeared. Back within the shadowed walls, the house was silent. The air, typically thick with dust and the scent of decay, now held a different quality, a stillness, deep and profound, like a breath held indefinitely. The house no longer felt hostile. Instead, it felt watchful. A guardian, perhaps, or a cage. The map lay spread on the drawing table in my study, exactly as I had left it. The unfinished lines, the cryptic symbols, the blank spaces where the malevolent heart of the estate pulsed. My eyes traced the contours, no longer seeing mere topography, but a membrane, a skin stretched taut over something ancient and terrible. The entity, the force that had demanded its due, was still there. It was not gone, merely quiescent. Appeased, and the price. The insidious drain had taken more than just my strength. Joy felt thin, like a worn fabric. It was the knowledge, the absolute, undeniable certainty of what lay beneath, and the silent covenant I had unknowingly entered. I picked up my pen, my fingers steady, though they trembled internally. I had once sought to complete the map, to fill in every detail, to bring light to the hidden corners. Now, I understood. The map was not meant to be completed in the way I had imagined. It was a record, a warning, and a chain. My hand hovered. What was the truth of that final space? Not lines and contours, but an emptiness, a profound absence that pulsed with a terrible power. I dipped the pen, but instead of drawing a feature, I drew a circle. A stark, unadorned circle, centered over the deepest point, and within it, a single, unwavering dot. A sentinel. A seal. A mark of containment. The act was not one of defiance, but of acceptance. This was the reveal/discovery, the malevolent presence was bound, but not destroyed. It had taken a part of me, a piece of my very essence, not as a sacrifice of life, but of self. I spent the next weeks in a strange, detached calm. I meticulously reinforced the old cellar, not with the intention of digging further, but of strengthening the barriers. I moved stones, cemented cracks, not to trap something within, but to keep something out, or rather, to ensure what was stayed in. Every nail driven, every plank set, was a ritual, a silent vow. My days were structured around this new purpose. I walked the grounds, not searching for clues, but observing, listening. The land itself felt different, charged with a latent energy, like a vast, sleeping beast. I was its keeper, its unwitting guardian. It was not threatening, not overtly malevolent, but a quiet, insistent awareness. A reminder. I would rise, light a lamp, and return to the map, tracing the new, stark circle with my finger. The horror was contained, yes. The immediate threat had receded. But it was not over. It would never be over. The peace I had found was not true peace, but a fragile, tense equilibrium.